Welcome back to our 11th session in our course on expository preaching. We are working through a series of talks on how to study and preach narrative literature. And we've introduced two of the three primary tools that we want to look at. We talked about setting, we've talked about characters, and in this session and the next session, we want to talk about the third tool, really I think the most powerful tool, and that is the analysis of a plot of a story. And so in this session, we really want to do two things. First, we want to introduce the steps or the components of a plot. And then second, we will try to briefly walk through an example in the Gospels together. And so let's jump right in, and we want to introduce the 7 steps or the 7 parts of really any plot. So as I go through the parts of the narrative plot, I would encourage you, think of maybe a story you've read or something you've enjoyed in your past, and think about how the author developed that story. And you may see that he or she used these parts of a plot development to tell the story. So let's talk about it together. The first part of any story is typically a prologue. In the prologue, we're introduced often to the setting. We're introduced to the characters. We receive other information that a reader or a listener may need to know about to be able to understand the story. And so typically in a narrative in the Bible, the prologue may simply be just a verse, 2 verses. After the prologue, we're introduced to either a conflict or a goal. In this section, the challenge or goal that the protagonist must face or resolve is introduced. It may be something upsetting that motivates the protagonist to action, or something that creates tension for the reader. But the protagonist is moved to accomplish a goal or to solve some type of problem. Oftentimes, if you have trouble recognizing what the conflict or goal is, you can skip to the end of the narrative and see what gets resolved and look back, and that's what the problem is that is being set out upon during this section. Following the introduction of the conflict or the goal, the third step is the development or complication of the story. Typically, in a good narrative, this is when events, relationships, or circumstances are introduced that intensify the action, that complicate the story in some way, and makes resolving the goal or solving the problem more difficult. It's during this part of the story when the tension really begins to increase, and there may be elements of surprise. The fourth section of a story is the climax or the turning point. This is the pivot. It's the point in the story that the action changes and the story turns, either in favor of the protagonist, which would be a comedy, or against the protagonist, which would be a tragedy. Following this is the consequence. The consequence is the outcome of the central turning point. This is the moment in the story where the tension is released. It shows what difference the turning point makes for the characters. The sixth step is the resolution. This is where the problem is solved, the goal is achieved, that action is fully reversed. And it's followed by an epilogue. Oftentimes, it's a final thought, it's closure to the story, it's something that connects us to the next story. If you look at the graphic on the screen, you'll see that this is in the shape of a top hat. Elements in the introduction to the problem or goal and the complication oftentimes mirror exactly what's said in the consequence and resolution. One of the benefits of analyzing the plot of a story, whether it's an individual story or a story that encompasses multiple stories, is you will see the great beauty that God and the biblical authors have taken in constructing the stories of the Bible. There is depth and beauty and significance in each of the stories that is elevated when we follow the plot structure through. And so we can look at individual stories like we will in just a moment, but also whole books make up a story. The book of Ruth is a good example. That the book of Ruth has 4 chapters. Each chapter is a story. Each chapter introduces a problem or a goal that gets solved at the end of the chapter. But the whole book itself is a story that introduces and resolves an issue that takes all 4 chapters to resolve. So in chapter 1, Naomi and her family leave because there is no food. By the end of chapter 1, they have returned to Bethlehem, and now the house of bread is what Bethlehem means. The house of bread once again has bread. And so the problem that's introduced in chapter 1 for the story in chapter 1 is solved at the end of chapter 1 as God visits his people. But there's a bigger problem, that Naomi has no heir. And that problem is just beginning to be solved at the end of chapter 1. And so chapter 1, that is a story in itself, really is just the development or the complication in the overall story of the book of Ruth. And the idea of Ruth providing an heir for Naomi is not solved until chapter 4. And it's not till the epilogue that we see that Naomi has a child, a male child to carry on her line. And we see in the epilogue that that line is the very line that will produce King David and ultimately will produce Christ. The book of Ruth is really probably written as an argument for David's kingship. It shows that David is worthy to be king. But we get to that point by seeing individual stories all along the way. It's a beautiful, complexly crafted story for us to enjoy. And as exegetes, it's our responsibility to be able to show that complexity, to show that development, to create the proper tension when there's tension in the story, and to show the resolution that God brings. I love the book of Ruth. It's interesting. Chapter 1, the problem is no food, and it's solved by God visiting food upon the people in Bethlehem. We talked earlier that God is a character we always need to look at. God is mentioned twice in the book of Ruth. One in chapter 1 when he visits the people with food. He's mentioned again at the end of chapter 4 where he visits Naomi with an heir. God cares about his people and he provides for their physical needs of food, but God cares about a widow woman, and he is going to visit her and provide for her in her need for an heir. It's a beautiful story of God. And so we want to practice the rest of this session and our next session of analyzing the plot structure of a story. You may remember when we studied epistles that the primary section of Scripture we would work with was the paragraph. In narrative, we don't do that. In narrative, it's not the paragraph, but it's a story or a pericope. That may be a term you're familiar with, but it's basically a story. And so we want to spend the rest of our session together looking at one pericope, one story, and analyzing it together. It's going to be the story of the Magi. It's a story we're all familiar with. It's found in Matthew 2. And I would invite you to turn there with me. The prologue of the story of the Magi is found in verse 1 of Matthew 2. And this story runs from Matthew 2, verse 1 to Matthew 2:12. It says, "Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, Magi from the east arrived in Jerusalem." So in this prologue, we are told several things about both the setting and the characters of our story. We're told the physical location, that we are in Bethlehem of Judea. We're told something about the historical setting, that this is during the days of Herod, king of Jerusalem. We're introduced to Herod. We're introduced to Magi who are arriving from the east. And so we have two arrivals. We have the arrival of Jesus. We have the arrival of the Magi. We have two cities. We have Bethlehem and we have Jerusalem. And we have two kings. We have King Jesus and King Herod that we're introduced into this story. In verse 2, we move from the prologue to the goal that is introduced. In verse 2, we move from the prologue to the goal of the story. We see the Magi speak. They say, "Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star in the east, and we have come to worship him." And so in this verse, the goal is that they've seen a star, they've seen something in creation, and therefore they've come to worship. And notice what they call him. They call the one they come to see is the King of the Jews. But there's a complication. In verse 3, we're told there's already another king that they're unaware of. And so the complication is in verses 3 to 6. It says, when Herod the king, and you notice that Herod is called king here twice. It's interesting. This is the only story or pericope that refers to Herod as king in the Bible. Other places he's called other names, but here he's called the king twice. And I think we'll see why that is in a moment. When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And so he gathered together all the chief priests and the scribes of the people. He inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born. And they said to him, he will be born in Bethlehem of Judea, for this is what has been written by the prophet. And you, Bethlehem, land of Judea, are by no means least among the leaders of Judah, for out of you shall come forth a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. And so in this section, you can feel the complications develop. These men have come a long way. They probably think they've now arrived and the complication of their journey is over. The danger, the hard travel, the long days, it's over. But for them, it's really just beginning because they've come to see the king. But in verse 3, it says Herod the king, and he is concerned and troubled about what has been said. And notice what it says. It says, all Jerusalem with him. The people are troubled as well. It's interesting that Herod does two things in verse 4. First, he gathers together the chief priests and the scribes of the people. So Herod knows who to go to. And notice the second thing, he knows who to ask. And it says he inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born. Look back at verse 2. What had been asked? What was the goal? They said, where is the king of the Jews? For we have come to worship him. They come asking simply to see the king of the Jews that they may worship. But Herod knows a couple of things. One, he knows that this refers to a birth. And two, he knows that when the Magi say king, the Jews were looking for a Messiah. It's interesting that Herod was able to translate that from king to Messiah. He goes to the chief priests. These are the ones who would know. These were men who had dedicated their lives to the study and the preparation of the Messiah. They've been looking for him for generations. When Herod goes to them, they don't need to say, give us a day to research it. They don't say, let us go get our Bibles. They have the verse memorized. They say it's written that it's in Bethlehem that the ruler will be born who will shepherd my people. And so the Jewish priests have the Old Testament and they don't need to search in any way, and they can tell Herod what it is that he needs to say. There's a turning point here in verse 7 and 8. It says, then Herod secretly called the Magi. And so the story starts in the east. It moves to Jerusalem. Then it moves into probably the public setting in the king's court. And now in verse 7, it moves to maybe a secret chamber inside the king's palace. And it says, Herod secretly called the Magi. He determined from them when the exact time of the star had appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem and said, go search carefully for the child. And when you found him, report to me so that I too may worship. So Herod gathers information. Herod lies to the wise men. Herod sends them to Bethlehem. And God uses Herod's selfish, secret motives to guide these wise men. Verse 9 introduces us to the consequence. It says, after hearing the king, the wise men went on their way, and the star which they had seen in the east went on before them. I think it's interesting that the star was with them from the east as they traveled to Jerusalem, and now the star is with them as they leave Jerusalem to go to Bethlehem. But the star brought them here. The star brought them to Jerusalem for this conversation, that God had orchestrated this. And now they head out with seeing the star they'd seen on the east before them until it came and it stood over the place where the child was. And it says in verse 10, when they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. The resolution is in verse 11. And after coming into the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother. They fell to the ground and they worshiped. Then opening their treasures, they presented to him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And then finally, the epilogue in verse 12. And having been warned by God in a dream not to return to Herod, the Magi left for their own country another way. And so as you look at the graphic on the screen, notice the parallel structure, that the prologue starts with 2 kings and 2 arrivals and 2 cities, that the Magi come from the east to Jerusalem. Verse 12 ends with them going from Bethlehem back to the east. They are guided by the hand of God with the star in verse 1. And now they are guided by God in verse 12 with the dream. Also notice the parallels between the introduction of the goal and the resolution. That they saw the star and they've come to worship a king. In 2:11, they worship the king. They achieve their goal. And so you see the parallel structure in the story. But also notice the complication, the parallel structure on the complication and the consequence. In the complication, it says that Herod, the other king, hears them. In the consequence, the Magi hear Herod. In the complication, it says Herod was troubled and all the people with him. Notice the response in verse 9 and 10. At the end of verse 10, it says, when they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. Remember, Hebrew narrative doesn't add details for no reason. Matthew could have just said they were happy, they were joyful, or they had great joy. But he says they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. He uses 4 words to say what one word could say. It emphasizes their response. And I think it's interesting that those who follow earthly King Herod are troubled. Those who seek heavenly King Jesus rejoice exceedingly with great joy. Also, Herod knows that the king they look for is the Messiah. But I think it's worth pointing out that the Messiah they find is their king. That these men come and they bow down and they worship. But I think the main difference in the complication and the consequence is between the chief priests and the Magi. Think with me for a moment. These chief priests, these scribes, they had dedicated their life to the coming Messiah. They knew the scriptures by heart. When asked to quote Micah, they can quote it immediately. Where the Magi were far away, where the Magi had nothing but creation and stars, these men are in Jerusalem. They've dedicated their life to the Bible. They have everything. When word comes that a king has been born, Magi leave everything. Herod knows enough to be concerned. Notice what it says these chief priests do after they quote the verse in verse 6. Look in verse 7 through verse 12. What else do the chief priests and the scribes do? They do nothing. I think that's something we're supposed to notice. My expectation would be if I was looking for something all my life and you came to me and said, that thing has come and it's 3 miles down the road, that I can walk there and be back by lunch, I would at least go and look. And these Magi come to Herod, they quote scripture, and then they disappear. And so what is this story about? If I were to preach this story, I would entitle it, Choose Your King. I think what this story is here for is the Magi are a foil. You may remember we talked about foils, that foils are characters that, minor characters that come into a story really to highlight what another character should do. At this point in Matthew, we see these chief priests who should be the biggest fans of Jesus, who should have been the ones most concerned about finding him. When they're told he's there, they don't even go look. The Magi do what the chief priests should do. See, I think Magi in Babylon were of the priestly class. We're introduced in verse 1 to 2 kings, King Herod and King Jesus. And the story is the contrast between the pagan priests who are Magi and the Jewish priests who are chief priests. One is at great distance, at great cost. It takes great time. They have nothing but a star. The other has proximity. They have the Bible. They have everything. And yet one chooses Herod as king. One chooses baby Jesus as king. One ends in trouble, and one ends with rejoicing exceedingly with great joy. If I were to tell this story, I would name it Choose Your King. And I would have an opening story, an opening image about somebody who made what appears to us a crazy choice. Maybe it's the story of Jim Elliot and his statement of right before he was killed out on the mission field in Ecuador, and he wrote that a man is no fool who gives up what he can never keep to gain what he can never lose. And that we all have a choice to make. As I move into the need, I would talk about we all have a choice to make and create that need for my congregation. And then as I talk about the context and how Matthew's using this story serves in the prologue of the Gospel of Matthew to set up who are the chief priests. That the chief priests are enemies and opponents of Jesus before they ever know his name. Because when they were presented with their Messiah, they didn't want to be bothered enough to walk to Bethlehem. And then I would walk through this story and I would try to tell it in such a way that people would feel the tension. They would understand the difficulty of the choice, and they would see the great outcomes, the great difference in the outcome of the two choices. And then in application, the application would be we as well have that choice to make. What choice will you make? And would drive that home as an opportunity for the gospel. And so hopefully just these few moments walking through this story highlights the way that plot can be used to create interest and to accurately tell and interpret a story in such a way that it will do our goal of preaching, which is to make the main point of the story, the main point of the sermon, choose your king. And to make the structure of the story, the structure of my sermon, as I walk through that plot structure and I develop those characters. And then to move to application so that ultimately there's the opportunity for life change. We'll come back next session and we'll look at one more narrative example.